Hello, and a massive welcome to you. Seriously, whether you're, commuting right now, maybe going for a walk, or just taking a quick moment for yourself, we are so thrilled to have you joining us today for this deep dive.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for being here, everyone. It's going to be a really interesting one today.
It really is. So the core mission for today's deep dive is, well, we're unpacking a really fascinating transcript we got our hands on. It's this deep philosophical and psychological conversation between two individuals. They're called Jack and Emma in the source. And it's all about basically the architecture of human choice.
Right, which sounds, a bit academic at first, but it is incredibly grounded. The central premise that the material really zeroes in on is this question of how much of the person you've become was actually your choice.
Wow, yeah. Which is a heavy question.
It is. Because, most of us love to believe we are the authors of our own lives, right? We like to think we're in charge. But today we're going to use these sources to deconstruct the invisible scripts that might be quietly driving our decisions.
And I want to set the tone right up front for you listening. The goal here is absolutely not to make you feel bad about your choices or induce some sort of existential crisis.
Right. Definitely not the goal.
Yeah, it's really about providing this sort of aha moment. It's about seeing the difference between genuinely living your own values and just, simply doing what other people expect of you.
Exactly. And the source material starts off by challenging a really fundamental assumption we make about ourselves, which is this idea of our inherent goodness or our own agency.
Right. It draws this really sharp, kind of uncomfortable distinction between being a good person and trying to be a good person, which, on the surface sounds like the exact same thing.
Right. It sounds like semantics, but the transcript breaks it down in this brilliant way. Being good means you're doing what you genuinely believe is right internally, like it aligns with your core.
Yeah.
But trying to be good, that often means you're doing what other people think is right. You're behaving well, sure, but you're not actually living according to your own values. It's performative.
Okay, wait, let me push back on this for a second just to unpack it. Because isn't trying to be good still better than nothing? If I'm acting politely to someone I find super annoying just because society expects it, isn't that just basic civilization? When does that actually cross the line into, losing my own identity?
That is a completely fair point, and it's a tension the sources address. Basic politeness, yeah, that's just the social contract. But the danger is what the experts in the transcript call performative alignment on a macro scale.
Performative alignment, okay.
Right? When you constantly prioritize external definitions of goodness, like what your peers dictate or your parents or society at large, you start applying that to major life choices.
Like your career or who you marry.
Exactly. And when you do that continuously, you slowly erode your own internal compass. The sources explain that it leads to life that looks, beautiful on the outside, completely successful, but internally, it just feels entirely hollow.
Oh, wow. So for everyone listening right now, just think about a recent big decision you made. Really think about it. Did you make it because it deeply aligned with your core values? Or, if you're being really honest, was it just the right thing to do in the eyes of someone else?
It's a tough question to ask yourself. And to understand how we get trapped in this good person paradox, the sources suggest we have to look back at the instructions we're given right from childhood.
Right, the programming.
Yeah, the programming.
Yeah.
Because we are rarely taught to ask a kid, hey, who do you want to become? Instead, we're handed this pre-written checklist.
Oh, I know the checklist. It's be responsible.
Be polite.
Work hard, get good grades.
Right, get a stable job, don't take unnecessary risks, and most importantly, don't disappoint people.
Yeah, do not disappoint the family. And the thing is, the source notes that this is actually really good advice on paper. It keeps you safe.
Yeah.
But it creates this incredibly dangerous blur between two very different concepts, responsibility and obedience.
Yes, this distinction is one of the most powerful takeaways from the material. We treat those words like they mean the same thing, but psychologically they are completely different.
So how do the sources define them?
So responsibility is defined as, I understand the consequences of my choices, and I am fully willing to deal with them. It's internal. It's ownership.
Okay, and obedience?
Obedience is, I'm doing this because I am terrified of what will happen if I don't. It's entirely based on fear and external pressure.
Okay, I want to use an analogy here to really cement this for the listener, because reading this part of the source material made me think of like driving a car.
Oh yeah, the car analogy works perfectly here.
Right, so responsibility is like you actually have your hands on the steering wheel, you're driving. You know that if you take a turn too fast and crash, it's on you. You own the car, you own the mistake.
Exactly, you feel the road.
But obedience, and this is the creepy part, obedience is like you're sitting in the driver's seat, you've got your hands on the wheel, but the steering column isn't connected. Someone else on the outside is operating the car with a remote control.
Wow, yeah.
And from the outside, it looks like you're driving.
Yeah.
But internally, you are terrified and completely powerless because you don't actually control the brakes or the gas.
That is the scary part that the analysis highlights. To anyone standing on the sidewalk watching that car go by, a life of responsibility and a life of obedience look exactly the same.
It's completely identical.
Right. You have the successful career, you're paying the bills, you're taking care of your family, the vehicle is moving perfectly down the road, but the internal reality is completely different. One driver feels grounded, and the other is just bracing for a crash they can't prevent.
And you know what happens when you successfully execute that life of obedience for years and years? You get exhausted.
Long tired.
Yeah, the deep dive explores this really specific anecdote from the source material. It's about someone in their 20s, and they did everything right.
They hit every mark on the checklist.
Exactly. They saved money, kept a super stable job, made their family proud, never got into any trouble. And the text points out there was no dramatic crisis, no rock bottom. But this person was just constantly, chronically exhausted.
Because the energy it takes to maintain that image, the image of someone who has everything under control and perfectly aligns with everyone's expectations, it's a massive cognitive load. You're burning fuel just performing.
And here is the real trap, right? The source points out that eventually this pressure isn't even coming from other people anymore. It comes from within. You internalize the remote control.
Yeah, it becomes automatic. It's a behavioral loop. You get good grades, right?
Yeah.
And then you're praised. So you learn, okay, I must keep getting good grades to be loved.
Yeah.
You're helpful to a friend. People assume you're always available. And suddenly saying no feels like you are literally becoming a different person.
This is where it gets really interesting to me. Nobody has to actively pressure you anymore because you've learned how to perfectly pressure yourself. The external voice, your mom, your boss, society, just seamlessly becomes your own internal voice.
The psychological weight of that automatic adjustment is staggering. The experts in the transcript break it down.
Yeah.
When you build your entire identity around being the helpful one or the responsible one, the fear isn't just that people will get angry if you stop.
Right, it's deeper than anger.
Much deeper. You fear that they literally won't recognize you anymore, that you will lose your place in the tribe. It feels like self-annihilation to stop performing the role.
And because we feel not being recognized by our own loved ones, actually setting boundaries or changing our lives can feel like we are committing a crime.
It feels like an act of violence against a relationship.
Yeah, the source text discusses how changing yourself can deeply hurt people, even when you aren't doing anything objectively wrong. There's this example they give of a really responsible sibling, right? The one who always helps out financially, the rock of the family.
Right, the person everyone relies on.
And suddenly, this sibling decides, you know what? I'm moving to another country to pursue my own life. Now, because family relationships come with all these unspoken heavy expectations, that new choice feels to the family like a massive betrayal.
It disrupts the entire ecosystem. The family has optimized around that sibling carrying the weight.
Exactly. And I really want to stop here for a second and emphasize a massive realization from the text for you listening. This is huge. Someone being disappointed in you doesn't automatically mean you've done something wrong.
I'm so glad you highlighted that. It's so counterintuitive to how we're raised.
Right, because we feel like if mom is crying, I must be a monster.
Exactly. The source explains why we have that flawed reflex. We mistakenly treat someone else's emotional pain, their disappointment, as empirical evidence that we made the wrong or immoral decision. But the analysis breaks down how we have to decouple our self-worth from other people's reactions.
Which is incredibly hard to do.
Oh, it's brutal. But you have to realize that someone can genuinely love you and still disagree with your life choices. They can be deeply disappointed in a boundary you set and still respect you. Disappointment is just friction from an unmet expectation. It's not a verdict on your morality.
So how do the sources suggest we manage that change? Because it sounds so messy.
It is messy. The text makes a great point. You have to give people time to adjust to the new you. Modern internet advice often says, if they don't respect your boundary immediately, cut them out.
Oh yeah, the whole toxic label, just block them.
Right, which is simple, but often destructive. The transcript argues that cutting people off is the easy way out. Changing a relationship without destroying it, that takes immense patience. It requires a willingness to sit in the discomfort of disappointing each other while the new dynamic settles.
Okay, so we've talked about what happens when you disappoint others by changing, but let's flip it. What happens when you do everything to please them, you don't rock the boat, you achieve all the success they wanted for you, and you are still absolutely miserable?
This is what the text calls successful unhappiness. And it describes it as one of the most isolating psychological experiences a person can have.
Successful unhappiness. Man, that phrase hits hard.
It does, because you excel at a career everyone else respects. You make good money, you have the right marriage, but you secretly hate your life.
Yeah.
And the worst part is, you feel immense guilt for even complaining.
Right, because from the outside, everyone is telling you how lucky you are. You have the dream life. Who are you to complain?
Exactly. You're trapped in a golden cage, and society acts like you're ungrateful if you want out.
And so what usually happens, according to the sources, is we reach for what they call the illusion of the fix, or the geography cure.
The geography cure, yes.
Which is this warning about turning every uncomfortable internal feeling into a reason to radically change your external life. Like, I'm miserable at this corporate job in the city, so I'm going to quit, move to a cabin in the woods, and start a farm.
Right. I just need a fresh start.
But the text says this doesn't always work because, well, you bring yourself with you. You can change the environment completely, but if you don't change your internal pattern, you're doomed to repeat it.
Exactly. You leave the job where you overworked, you move to the cabin, you start a small business, and within a year, you are automatically overworking yourself at the new business. Mm-hmm. The location changed, but the obedience to workaholism didn't.
Okay, wait, let me jump in with a pushback here. Because if change isn't always the answer, and the geography cure is a myth, how on earth do you know when something genuinely needs to change versus when you just need to, sit with the discomfort and work on yourself?
It's a vital question, and the source provides a very specific metric for this. Pay attention to patterns and timelines.
Timelines, okay.
Right. Being tired and frustrated with your job for a week, that's not a life crisis. That's just temporary discomfort. But being unhappy for 3 straight years, well, constantly telling yourself, oh, next quarter will be different, or once this project ends, I'll be happy, that is a pattern worth examining.
So it's the cyclical nature of it.
Yes. You have to differentiate temporary environmental discomfort from persistent structural dissatisfaction. If you've been miserable for years despite small changes, the structure itself is the problem.
That is so practical. And speaking of practical, how do we actually articulate this internal struggle? Because half the battle is just finding the words.
It really is.
The source material provides this brilliant linguistic deep dive. It breaks down specific English expressions that we use every day, which actually reveal our true psychological state regarding choice. I'd love to unpack some of these with you.
Let's do it. It's fascinating how our casual language betrays our invisible scripts.
Okay, first one, the phrase, living up to other people's expectations. We say it all the time.
Right. And the sources point out the spatial imagery in that phrase, living up to. It implies a hierarchy. The expectation is this pre-existing shape positioned above you, and you have to stretch and contort yourself to fit into a mold that someone else designed. It implies your natural state isn't enough.
Wow, just the word up carries so much weight. Okay, what about this one? I don't want to let them down. I say this constantly.
Most of us do. But the text explores how this doesn't mean you were threatened by them. It implies a really heavy emotional burden, like you are physically carrying someone else's hopes or emotional stability on your shoulders.
So if you drop them, if you change your mind, you're the bad guy.
Exactly. It frames your independence as an act of negligence against someone you love.
Okay, this next one is the one I absolutely marveled at when reading the source. The distinction between I feel like I have to versus just saying I have to.
It's a huge gap. Astronomical.
It is. Because if I say I have to pay my taxes, that is an external necessity. If I don't, I go to jail. It's objective reality.
Right.
But when I say I feel like I have to go to this family dinner...
Right, the pressure is entirely psychological or emotional. There is no law forcing you. By adding I feel like, you are linguistically admitting that the bars of the cage are in your own head. You are coercing yourself.
That is simultaneously terrifying and so liberating, because if I'm the jailer, I have the key.
Exactly.
Okay, here's a really nuanced one. I've started to question whether this is really what I want.
The experts note this is a very safe, soft way to express uncertainty. It allows you to explore the idea that you might be on the wrong path without actively condemning your past choices as a total failure. It's a gentle pivot.
I like that. It gives you some grace.
Okay.
But what about when you need to be firm? The text contrasts two ways of setting a hard boundary. I'm not willing to do that versus I'm not able to keep doing that.
Yeah, the analysis here is super helpful for anyone terrified of conflict. I'm not willing to is incredibly strong. It's decisive, but it can sound harsh, maybe even hostile, because it centers entirely on your volition. I have the energy, I just refuse to give it to you.
Right, which will probably start a fight.
Most likely. But saying, I'm not able to keep doing this in the same way, shifts the focus. It softens the blow by framing it as a lack of capacity, not a lack of care. It says the structural load is too heavy, while still firmly maintaining the boundary.
That is such a good tool for the toolkit. But it brings us to a tricky point. Now that we have the language to express our boundaries, does that mean we just run around rejecting everything and everyone who ever influenced us?
Right, we just burn the house down.
Because the internet loves that idea. But the source text explicitly rejects that simplistic, follow your dreams at all costs mentality.
It does. It acknowledges that sometimes, it is a little selfish to disappoint people to live your life. But you can't just abandon your dependence.
Yeah.
You can't leave your kids to go travel the world in the name of finding yourself and claim it's just healthy boundary setting.
Because freedom doesn't erase responsibility. And responsibility doesn't erase freedom. Adulthood, according to the material, is really about negotiating expectations, not just eliminating them completely.
Conscious negotiation, exactly. We live in a network of relationships.
And I want to point out something that really stood out to me. You don't have to reject being, say, a responsible or hardworking person just because it was your parents who taught you to be that way.
Yes. This is a huge misconception.
Right. People realize they've been following a script, so they want to do the exact opposite just to prove they are free. But the problem isn't where the idea came from. The problem is just whether you've ever stopped to examine if you still actually believe it.
The experts in the transcript redefine independence here in a really beautiful way. True independence isn't walking around saying, I don't need anyone, I don't care what you think.
Which is just being a jerk, usually.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
True independence is having the psychological security to say, I can listen to your advice, I can hear your expectation without automatically obeying it. The ultimate question isn't who gave me this value, it's simply, do I still choose this value now, today?
So bringing this all down to earth for you listening, what can you actually do tomorrow with all this information? Because it's a lot of theory.
It is. But the source deep dive ends with some highly practical, low-stakes starting points for reclaiming your agency.
And the very first rule is, don't quit your job tomorrow.
Please don't. No sudden, catastrophic changes. Start really small. The first step the text suggests is just to notice. Notice the exact moments in your day when you hear yourself say yes, but your brain is screaming no.
Don't even change the answer yet. Just notice the friction.
Exactly. Just log the dissonance. The second step is to notice the decisions you make purely on autopilot. The things you do just because you did them yesterday.
And step 3 is a little uncomfortable. You have to identify whose opinion you are most terrified of disappointing.
Right. Put a face to the invisible script. Is it your dad, your partner, your boss? Naming them shrinks the fear down to size.
And the final practical step. Pay attention to what you do when nobody is watching.
This is so telling. Because when nobody is watching, you have zero reason to perform. There's no audience to clap and no audience to be disappointed. What you gravitate towards in those moments is a massive clue to your authentic self.
Which perfectly sets up the ultimate question from the text. I want you listening to really sit with this one. Are you ready?
It's a big one.
If nobody would be disappointed by my decision, what would I choose?
Wow.
Right. Just sit with that. If you had a magic wand and could guarantee zero disappointment from anyone, what would you do?
And again, to emphasize what the experts say,
Yeah.
you do not have to act on the answer to that question immediately. You don't have to blow up your life. Just notice the answer.
Yeah.
Because sometimes, and this is the best part, sometimes you ask that question and you realize you choose the exact life you're already living.
Yes. You realize you genuinely love your partner or your job, and it is actually your choice. The text says that realization that you aren't just performing, but actively choosing your life is the greatest aha moment of all. That changes everything without changing a single external thing.
Absolutely. The internal experience shifts from fearful obedience to grounded ownership.
Well, to wrap up this deep dive, Growing up, truly maturing, means taking a much closer look at these inherited roles we've been playing. If you look at the role and you like it, keep it, claim it. But if you tap on it and realize it's hollow, if you realize you don't actually want to play that part anymore, it might be time to put it down, even if someone is disappointed.
Yeah.
We really hope this deep dive into the source material gave you something profound to think about today. Maybe it even gave you the vocabulary to have a difficult but really necessary conversation with someone in your life.
And I want to leave you with a final, somewhat provocative thought to mull over, which builds on everything we've discussed.
I love these. Lay it on us.
Consider this. What if the people you're so terrified of disappointing, the ones holding the remote control, what if they are actually trapped in their own cycle of obedience? What if they are just blindly executing the scripts handed to them by their parents? If that's true, then what if, by finally having the courage to break your own patterns and disappoint them, you are silently giving them the exact permission they desperately need to break theirs?
That is incredible. Your boundary could be the key to their cage. Just wow, what a place to leave it. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. Take care of yourselves, think about those scripts, and we'll be right back here with you next time.
It's been a pleasure. Take care, everyone. Farewell.